Hi, I'm Kathy Biehl, and I'm the author of Eat, Drink, and Be Wary, Cautionary Tales. And I am chatting today with Aileen Weintraub, who is the author of Knocked Down, a High-Risk Memoir. And we're going to, as our starting point, be talking about the love language of food. Now, what in the world would food possibly have to do with something called a high-risk memoir? Hang on, you'll find out in just a second. My framing for our conversation is a few sentences from my essay table for one. When people share food, especially if one of them was the cook, the subtext usually runs something like this. Let me prove my love to you with this delicious meal, and you can prove your love in return by eating a lot. Second or third helpings, please. So, Aileen, what's your book about, and what does it have to do with food?
So Knocked Down is about being a commitment-phobic Brooklyn girl who moves to the Hudson Valley, has a whirlwind romance, and ends up on pregnancy-related bed rest in a rickety old farmhouse due to unusually large fibroids. And as her marriage starts to collapse from the stress of being on bed rest, and the farmhouse starts to do the same, she really has to come to terms with who she is and what she wants.
I think you probably told someone what this is about before. That's a very good description.
Thank you. I've been practicing, so I've had a couple of interviews and things are going really well with the book launch. It comes out on March 1st, and I've been really busy. So it's been a great experience so far.
Yeah, if she's in your feed, you're seeing constant, oh my God, this just happened. Incredible posts, which are just wonderful. Yahoo News picking up a couple of excerpts. But getting back to food. So the one thing that struck me just incredibly was your being a vegetarian and what your mom chose to do. Can you talk about that?
Yes, so my mother really stepped up when I was on bed rest. I was on bed rest for 5 months, and she lived in New York City, and she would come up on the bus from Port Authority, and she would bring tons of food. And when I say like tons of food, I mean it's a bit of an exaggeration, but she would bring an entire suitcase filled with meat on the bus. And then she would cook and clean and do all of these wonderful, loving, nurturing things. And the one problem with this suitcase filled with meat is that I'm a vegetarian. But this is how she knew to show love. And she wanted to bring me comfort food from my childhood. And I didn't eat it, but it was still really meaningful to know she was there for me and so nurturing and so loving and really supportive.
Was even did she prepare it for your husband when she was there?
She did. She prepared for my husband, and she prepared so much that there was no way that he could possibly eat it all. We did have a freezer full of meat as we had growing up, and so it was definitely helpful. And the truth is, while I was on bed rest, not only was I a vegetarian, I couldn't really eat anything. I didn't gain much weight. I was in pain a lot of the time because I had these fibroids pressing on my cervix pretty much the whole time. And I basically lived on baby carrots and hummus and cashew nuts. And then my husband for a while would bring me milkshakes, which was a huge part of my day. So every day at 4 o'clock, he would walk through the door like this savior with a beautiful chocolate milkshake. And it was my only connection to the outside world. He was working 12 hours a day. I never saw him, but he would stop in and hand me this milkshake, usually on the phone or multitasking. He would stay like maybe a minute or two, but it was still a really important connection. And then unfortunately, I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. And so the milkshake stopped. And so that was really hard because then I didn't really see my husband at all throughout the day.
But didn't he he also made little packages for you, right?
So every morning we realized I couldn't get out of bed at all. It was very strict bed rest. So I would get out of bed to go to the bathroom a couple of times a day, and that was really it. I would shower for like a minute or two. And so we came up with this idea to pack a cooler full of food. And so every day before he left, he would pack these little Ziploc bags filled with goodies. And I was eating them from bed, so that was challenging because I was laying down, so I wasn't supposed to be upright at all. As a matter of fact, my hips were supposed to be kind of propped up or elevated as much as possible to take the pressure off my cervix. And so I had the dog next to me, and this was very comedic because the dog felt like, well, you're eating in bed, the food's on the floor, whose food is this really? So, so we would do a lot of sharing, or, you know, I'd be one Cheerio for me, one Cheerio for the dog, that kind of thing. So, and that's how I was able to show my dog love. My dog really, her name was Sachi Red, and she was my companion throughout bed rest. She doesn't get enough credit for keeping me company.
So you were sharing the food love.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Getting back to the notion of brisket, I was wondering when you actually smelled it cooking, did it bring any memories back, or was it like a subliminal, mom's here, everything's okay, I'm at home, or did you notice that at all?
Yeah, so a big part of my book is actually about food and my mother's cooking. And there's a scene when she comes and she's making meatballs. Besides the brisket, she's also very famous for her meatballs. Those are her two big dishes. And kugel, which she mailed to me, actually. She mailed me an entire frozen kugel. And there's a scene in the book where I'm trying to unwrap the kugel, and she's put so much duct tape and bubble wrap around it that I don't know if it's a kugel or if it's like an explosive device, you know?
And for people for all the people who grew up without a lot of that kind of cooking around them, can you explain what a kugel is?
Sure. So it's really just a noodle casserole. It's noodles, eggs, and then you can make it sweet with like maraschino cherries, or you can make it salt and pepperish. And a kugel is basically anything you can put in a casserole dish. But my mom was famous for her noodle kugels. So, but to get back to your question about the cooking in my kitchen, I remember there's a scene in my book where I'm in bed, eyes closed, and with my mom there, I'm really thinking, okay, I really have to be strict. I can't move. She's watching to make sure I'm doing exactly what the doctor says. So basically could just move my eyeballs. And I'm hearing her banging and clanging, and I can kind of see her like whipping around the kitchen, like throwing rags against the sink, stirring. And it really brought me back to childhood when I would, you know, sleep in late and hear my mom in the kitchen cooking breakfast or making dinner at night or cleaning up. And it was really comforting just to know she was there. And even till this day, you know, I think I mentioned that this is my mother's house that I'm zooming in from today. And I've spent the week here, and she's been nurturing me the entire week. So much food. There's so much food. I'm going to have to get all new pants when I get home. Every kind of carbohydrate you can imagine, bagels, pizza. We're in New York City, so we're really taking advantage of all of the yummy food. And she's been in the kitchen all week, and it's so comforting just to know some things never change.
So your inner child is having a good old time, feeling very safe.
We're having a blast. Yep. And she loves it. And she said to me, you know, when I say, can we stop talking about food, or can we do something? And she's like, you know, this is how I show my love to you. So
she actually said that.
Yeah, she really, it's a family tradition to show love through food.
I think that's the way in a lot of families. I've heard many stories from many people, and it doesn't take much, it's been my experience, to have something send you back in time. and have you suddenly be thinking about, wait a minute, I've tasted this before, or what does this mean? You have you told me something about being in Amsterdam once.
Oh, right. So that was a part of your book that really resonated with me when you talk about cellular memory. And a lot of my food memories, I realize now as an adult, have to do with my grandparents because we spent a lot of time with them. And they were always so warm and loving and nurturing. And so I was traveling when I was in my 20s, and I was in Amsterdam eating cookies, and they had anise in it or anisette, and I just kept gobbling them up, and I was like, these are so familiar, and I don't know why, and they're so comforting. And it took a while, and then I told my mom about it, and she's like, well, grandma used to have cookies just like that in her kitchen and used to eat them all the time. And while I didn't remember that, it definitely triggered the memory, the smell, and the love associated with it.
There was a subconscious draw to it.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about that in your book too.
Oh, I'm utterly fascinated by that, because there are things that happen and your conscious mind isn't behind the wheel, and you're just drawn to things and experience them in a very, very different way. I had a therapist once tell me, while I was journaling a bunch of stuff, and I found myself writing that I wanted an Almond Joy, and I just looked at the words because, well, yeah, I loved candy when I was a kid, but I wouldn't have picked Almond Joy as like, oh, this is a real favorite. So my therapist said, why don't you plan a meal based on what your inner child wants? And I went, okay. And it was like nutritionally completely unsound, but I walked around the grocery store and picked stuff that various parts of me at different points in my life thought was really, really good. And that's all I ate. And I'll tell you, it was very carb heavy. It was very carb heavy.
So that's one of my favorite scenes in your book, is when your therapist tells you that. And I've been thinking, well, what would my inner child meal be? And I would love to know, and I would love to know what you chose.
Oh, I have to actually look it up, because, but I'll do that. Yeah. It will just take a second.
I think yours might have been, at least it started with Doritos and Dr.
Oh, yeah. And which, of course, I will not eat now because the Dorito recipe has changed. Several things that I really liked when I was a kid don't taste the same now. And it's not just because I've had a bunch of taste buds die off, which is what happens with humans. That's why you can't stand asparagus when you're a kid, but you eat it when you're an adult. But oh, here it is. There's a list. Klondike bars, I still like them. Iced raisin cookies, Almond Joy, Doritos, and Dr. Pepper. That was it. And also Dr. Pepper doesn't have the same recipe as when I was a kid either. I grew up at ground zero for Dr. Pepper. I grew up really pretty much across the highway from the bottling plant. And it was made with cane sugar. And now, of course, it's made with high fructose corn syrup. I have a bottle on one of my shelves of original recipe Dr. Pepper, which I will never open because there's no carbonation left in it. It's probably, it's very old at this point. It might be like 22 years old. But so I have it. So what do you think your inner kid would want? What you've been eating this week?
Yeah, well, that's part of it. I think it would probably include a lot more candy. We used to go to the candy store often after dinner. We had bodegas on our corner growing up in Brooklyn. And I would take a walk with my father, and he'd buy me a Hershey bar. And Smarties, which are those little round candies that come in a long package like that. And then Swedish goldfish are some of my favorites. And so I'd probably get really sick if I just had a childhood meal. Bagels, I have to say, my mother's pot roast, her meatballs. So it would be quite an eclectic meal for sure.
And I noticed one thing, you mentioned walking down the street with your father. So there is a ritual and a relationship aspect to one or more of these foods as well.
Oh, absolutely. And one memory that will always be with me is my grandfather used to pick me up from school every Thursday. And he would take me to the candy store. And back then, the candy stores had counters. And so he would get like a pack of cigarettes, and then we would sit down, and they had the old-fashioned stools, and we would get an egg cream and a pretzel every Thursday. And every Thursday he would tell me that he forgot his wallet. And it was just a joke that we did and then we would have this whole discussion about what we could do to pay for it, how we were gonna get out of there without paying, and he'd be like, well, I would leave my watch, or I'd leave you, or, and it was just a fun little game that we played. And then he would buy me a comic book or some other little trinket. And so it was just really, reading your book has brought so much of that back for me. So that's been a great experience.
I have found that as people read it, they send me texts if they know me well enough to have my phone number, or email, or messages on Facebook as they're reading it. It's like, live tweeting, watching a movie or something. They're doing this with their, oh my God, I'm remembering this, and I'm remembering this. And I recently reconnected with a guy I dated in high school that I hadn't talked to since I was 22 years old, which is an interesting development. And he just started sending me photographs of menus, not just what he got at these places in the neighborhood where we grew up. For some reason, he has menus in his collection. So I've been getting that kind of thing.
I love reading menus. I always collect menus. It's so funny. And I don't know why I do it. I just love even when I'm eating a meal, I love to see, it's almost like reading a recipe book. And it's so much potential, like, oh, what can I order next? So that's fun. And I think that when you connect with your readers on that level after they've read your book, I think that's when you've had an impact and made a difference. And when I have an article come out, or as people are starting to read my book and I'm getting DMs and messages, I'm feeling like I've made a little bit of a difference, and I've touched somebody's life, and something I've written has resonated with them. And not to go off topic, but yesterday I wrote a piece for Huffington Post about postpartum anxiety. And so many people DM'd me to say, thank you so much for writing about this. I'm going to go find support. I've been struggling alone. So no matter what happens, I've at least helped one person find the support they need. So that's really important to me.
You threw out a lifeline.
Yeah.
Well, doubling back just a second, talking about menus, this leads to the whole notion of what I call Restaurant Row on Memory Lane. Are there places that you go to, not largely because of the role they played in your life when you were younger?
Yeah, so being in Brooklyn, I've been hitting all of my favorite spots, and it's hard because a lot of these places have closed that I really want to go to, but the ones that are open are so wonderful. So I think I was telling you before we started that there's this pizza place I grew up on, and everyone has their favorite pizza place. And this is and nobody can tell me that there's any better pizza anywhere. And because it has the memory attached to it, and I remember sitting with my parents and eating pizza around the kitchen table and laughing and joking. And so it doesn't matter what it tastes like now, it just brings me back to those moments. And so last night we ordered pizza, and it's still so good. And of course, now that I'm older, I'm not 16 anymore, and I ate so much pizza, I was up all night. so that's something that you have to remember when you go back to your childhood places, is moderation, for sure.
There's one place in Dallas I always go to that's in the neighborhood where I grew up. And I eat a largely plant-based diet myself for a variety of reasons. But I go to a German sausage house every time I'm in Dallas, because It was founded by the father of someone in my high school class, and it's actually really authentic German. And I would skip the dining hall in college and walk over there to eat. And every single high school reunion, I end up there. It's just part of what I do. And the food still is really good.
Well, I have to say, part of my book is about my interfaith marriage, and my husband's family is Austrian, and so we have very different traditions around food. And so he has this love of German food. So he has introduced me to all these German restaurants up by our house, and schnitzels, and I mean, I don't eat all of the meat stuff, but the spatzel and all of the other stuff and the side dishes and the cabbage. And so it's really expanded my palate. And I've introduced him to all these Jewish foods, and now he loves my mother's pot roast. So it's been really interesting to see two cultures coming together and sharing their love of food in so many different ways.
That reminds me of a story I heard just on Tuesday about a relative of a friend of mine who works in a warehouse where everybody brings food for lunch, and they have a big communal lunch. And they've been doing this for decades, and people are of many nationalities there. And my friend said his brother is always bringing stuff home that he or his parents have never heard of. And I got a couple of cans of coconut milk out of this because nobody else knew what to do with it. And I went, oh, I know what to do with it. Give it to me. But it just sounds like an incredible thing in a place of business, people pulling their food and sharing from different cultures.
Yeah, I love that so much. And growing up, even in Brooklyn, where there's every kind of restaurant now, in my Jewish community, in my little section of Midwood, there weren't so many different options growing up. There was no sushi, there was no Indian food, Ethiopian food. So it's been really nice to see that evolve and have so many more options now.
Well, it teaches you a lot about how other people live. I lived in another country, not because I wanted to. When I was in high school, my father was a professor, and we got thrown into a German language school in Munich. And so I was the outsider. I mean, it really teaches you a whole lot. But learning another language and learning another culture without having it pounded into your head automatically exposes you to the reality that there are other ways to do things.
Yes.
On this planet, there's not this one way is the only way. And food is a particularly tasty way to go about this. I mean, I come from a couple of decades in Houston, which is basically Queens to the 100th power in terms of nationalities. And the dining scene there is mind-blowing with the different types of food you can stumble onto, and the different cultures that are there, and the number of languages. And I think Anthony Bourdain's last TV series, I forget what it was called, had one episode in Houston where not a single person was Anglo. Everybody he profiled was from a different country, different culture, different language. So that was really, really interesting what their food ways were. When you go back someplace that you've lived before, do you have a short list of, I must go here, I must go there, different restaurants and stuff?
Yes, absolutely. So growing up, we went to this restaurant called the Genovese House in Midwood, and we would go every Sunday with my grandparents, and my parents would order me the same thing. I would get a veal chop and baked clams and a Shirley Temple. And so unfortunately, that place has closed, as has many authentic Italian restaurants in Brooklyn. But there's this one place that is almost as good as I remember the Genovese House, and it's called Marco Polo. And so whenever we are in town, we make sure to get it. Even if during the pandemic, when we couldn't eat in restaurants, we would order the baked clams. So the baked clams have been this thing in our family for a really long time. And it just brings us back to our childhood and family and celebrations. And my brother and I are always like, want to get big clams and let's sneak off and go for some clams or something like that. And so that's the Italian food in Brooklyn is a very big part of my childhood. Bagels, lox. There's a scene in my book when my mother is planning her funeral with me, and I'm totally not interested. I'm like 1,000 weeks pregnant, and I'm watching some series about women giving birth in random places or not knowing they were pregnant. And I'm sitting on her couch because at some point I go to Brooklyn to bed rest there. And to find out why I go to Brooklyn, you have to read the book. But I'm sitting on her couch and she's planning her funeral and she's telling me all the food she wants at her funeral. And it's really very funny. And it's all based on fish and fish that you can put on a bagel, like lox, whitefish, tuna fish. And she's going down the list. And I'm like, okay. And we call it here in Brooklyn, we call it appetizing. And a lot of people haven't heard of that term. And so during the editorial process, everyone kept trying to correct it. And I started to doubt myself, and I had to look it up. And it turns out there's like this whole article in the New Yorker about it. And so it was just really interesting, even how we associate food, not only with life, but with death. Like this is what Jewish people order for their funerals, is platters of appetizing.
So it spans the lifetime.
Right. And it gives you an idea of my mother's sense of humor and her, how she is and around food. She's planned every meal, including the ones after her death. So she set us up for a very long time with food.
And do you have the experience of there's never too much, like there's a need to have overabundance?
Oh yes. So absolutely. So this is something as a hostess that I've had to come to terms with, because I am always cooking for so many more people than we're having. And then you go to other people's house and they have enough food, and it's not like 17 kinds of baked potatoes or 4 kinds of meats. It's one dish, one main dish, one side dish, one vegetable, one salad. And this was a big learning curve when I married into my husband's very waspy families. They're very refined, and they put out their meals on, buffet style, and then you walk up and you scoop it with your fancy spoons or whatever. Their servingware is much fancier. Ours is like 18 people, tables everywhere, plastic tablecloths, paper plates, all of that stuff. And then I would go to my mother-in-law's house, and there would be china and crystal, and everything was much more refined, and there was a lot less food, but it was also incredibly good food. And so that was a very interesting experience for me the first time I went to their house for Christmas.
I'm always astonished if I go to someone's house for dinner and they have one dish. I mean, that is it. Your dinner is one dish. Like, really?
Listen, I think that it's great. It's so much less work, and I don't think, you don't usually leave a place hungry, right? There's sometimes you do maybe, but it's definitely something I've tried to incorporate, making less but more meaningful dishes. Whereas growing up, we would have, someone would make the sweet potatoes, and someone would make the baked potatoes, and someone would make the sweet potatoes with pineapple, then someone would make the roast sweet potatoes. But of course,
sounds like there's an Italian household in my extended family that I spend a lot of holidays at, and you'll walk in and there will be food for 6 times the number of people who will be there, and often you go home with days worth of food afterwards.
Right. Well, that is the one thing that I was going to say, is we love leftovers. Leftovers are amazing. I always welcome leftovers. I will always take leftovers, and you can't go wrong with leftovers. So
I'm on team leftover myself. I would, I leftovers for breakfast, best thing possible. So you were starting to, you addressed this kind of in a backhanded way, but I want to go on it head on. So how are you extending food traditions into your own immediate family now that you have a husband and a kid?
Yeah. So one sneaky little thing I do is ask my mother to do a lot of cooking, and then I freeze it and bring it up to my house.
Okay.
Everybody's happy because my mom gets to cook for my family, and my family gets to eat her amazing, delicious food. I have some dishes that my son, who is now 15, absolutely loves and requests. And, I don't eat beef stew, but he loves beef stew, so I make it. I've made it so many times, I've never once tasted it, but I hear it's really good. And I make chili for him that he loves. And these are traditions that now that he's older, that we can start cooking together. And he's an athlete, so he's become much more strict about what he will eat and what he won't. So we do a lot of vegan dishes. We eat lots of salads. We get really creative with our salads. And I'm actually pleased to say that for Christmas, all he really wanted was a bowl and a salad chopper. So I must be doing something either terribly wrong or terribly right. So
Well, that's kind of a nice full circle from writing about how your mother expressed her love to how you're now doing this in your own family.
oh yeah, absolutely. It's a really good way to connect with a teenager, I think, is through food because they eat a lot. So so it's an easy connector. And
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, when my niece and nephew used to spend holidays at my house, we spent a lot of time in the kitchen preparing stuff together, making things up, baking cookies, but pulling the meal together. And my nephew is really, really into food at this point. His fiance is Russian, and when the first time he went to Moscow, he was sending me these photos of the New Year's celebrations and the different types of food. And I think you would feel very at home with the size of the spread that is put out by this family he's marrying into. Like, my God, that's a lot of food.
Yeah, I think that, the holidays is really something that brings people together around food, obviously. And so what we do in our house, I grew up as a conservative Jew in Brooklyn, and then I married outside of my religion. And so that's been very interesting in a lot of ways and sometimes challenging. And I've wanted to incorporate traditions from Judaism into our family life. And so while I'm not really as conservative as I was, I would say more reformed, we still do Shabbat dinner and the lighting of the candles and have a big meal together, usually fish or something like that. And I think those are creating food memories, especially for my child. So even though we're not very religious anymore, we are still passing something down to him that he will remember. And maybe when he's older, he'll have that cellular memory of food.
Mm-hmm. Of the ritual, the totality of it.
Yeah.
The candles. Yeah. Yes, I bet he will. That's really cool. So is there anything else you want to say about your book or the process of writing, or are you hungry? I want to go have whitefish. I'm not sure where I can find it.
Oh, I can probably get you some right on the corner. We may even have some in the refrigerator. So this is my book. It's called Knockdown, a High-Risk Memoir. There's a lot of food-related content. It's a really funny book, or so I'm told. It's a fast read, and it talks about my high-risk pregnancy, but it talks about so much more than just that.
It's one of those, it reminds me of something that one of my good friends said to me during an astonishing period in my life. Look in the mirror and say, this would have killed a lesser mortal.
Wow.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, I think.
Yeah.
Laughter gets you through a lot. Laughter and food get you through so much.
Yeah.
Those are words.
Sorry. Yeah. And just to say, if you'd like to find out more about me, please head over to my website at aileenweintraub.com, and you can buy this book wherever books are sold. And it's on Amazon if you'd like a signed copy. Rough Draft Bar and Books in Kingston is an amazing indie bookstore.
Wonderful. Well, this has been great. Oh, and guys, mine's all over the place. Eat, Drink, and Be Wary. I've got my thing on Blur. Cautionary Tales. I'll be in Dallas in mid-March at Kubi's, at the German restaurant, signing books, because that's what works out. So thanks, everybody, and bon appetit.
Bye-bye.